Happy New Year, everyone. I actually recorded this video in 2024, but it's scheduled for January the 1st, 2025. I want to start the new year with a almost prototypical Germanic people's history, that is the Herulis. The Heruli, also known as Eluri, and we will understand now why we're called like this, or simply Heruli without the H, or Herules, or Herulians, whatever you want to call them, were one of actually the smaller Germanic peoples during the migration era, with records documenting their existence, however, from the 3rd to the 6th century AD, right? And they're almost like the sort of every type, or at least sort of the most common group of Germanic peoples around. They were literally all over the place, as we will learn today. So there is that component of war bandism, we could say, that is possibly even connected with their name, which is of uncertain origin. In this, they share much of the uncertainties about other Germanic or other people's ethnogenesis in this quite turbulent period in European history, and also received a bit of a stigma of, say, fierce, terrible, violent, but in other ways instead valorous and especially warlike and military capable population, little by small. This is the case also for other groups that, for example, emerged small, became big later on, including the Longobards that crushed the Heruli, that apparently came back to Scandinavia to some of their relics because of this memory of this perceived like originary land of Scandia. That really makes like their sagas a bit like some of the most fascinating, some of the most archetypal for the entire Germanic history. Reason for which, even though there are, of course, still more important peoples to cover, also after the ones that we already treated in the migration era peoples series, I thought to dedicate two chapters to the Heruli to really look at their overall history. I know that you like this kind of topics, so I thought this to be a New Year treat of some sort, right? So let's give a sketchy introduction, first of all, about people if you really want to know the fundamentals. There were, as we'll learn, different groups of Heruli documented at different times and places. The most well-known, the best historically described, is the group established as a kingdom north of the Middle Danube. Right. Recently we made a video about the Rugi, and you know that lots of people passed through there, including the Longobards, others. And so likely encompassing the region where more or less Vienna is located today. There are different settlements. The Rugi were said to be located in Krems. Naturally, they would be settled on both banks of the Danube. We do not know in an extremely precise geographical sense how wide this dominion stretched, but we know, at least in this later phase, what happened for the survivors a bit of the migration here at this point, that is to have found hopefully permanent, too often temporary, this is the case of this Herulian group as well, dominion, right? Parcel of land where they could, well, without being wiped out by their neighbors. This kingdom bordered several other small ephemeral kingdoms during the late 5th and early 6th century, including those of the Skiri or Shiri, the Rugi, the Danubian Suebi, and the Gepids. The same, when we say kingdom here, we have to imagine, of course, like maybe a truly recognized monarchy among the Heruli, for the sake of unity of command during the migratory movements that had brought a clan essentially to some sort of hegemonic status, but not really like a centralized kingdom whereby literally everybody obeys to this lineage. On the contrary, these were generally very unstable groups, especially those that lived in the Barbaricum, like in this case, in very de-Romanized areas, or at least places where the local government did not really have enough resources to be that stable. There were different clans, especially in the case of the Heruli, also all around, and especially in their case, not necessarily connected with this kingdom, or at least though the ancestors of those who would later establish it, possibly in any way, right? Because we will see now that the name Heruli was probably bestowed upon some groups that did not really have an originally ethnic and political identity that would simply exclude any other group from that name, right? But we will get there. In any case, this Danubian Herulian kingdom was conquered by the Longobards in 508. There is a beautiful passage in Polydiacon where the Longobards have basically like Odin thundering from their back, like pushing against the Heruli, signifying this essentially providential path of Longobard victory. This was a really relevant step, in fact, in the Longobard migration. It did pass through to the annihilation, at least, of this kingdom, for which apparently splinter groups of Heruli migrated probably back to Sweden, if we understand, of course, their origin being fundamentally Scandinavian, but also, at that time, Ostrogothic Italy, and even present-day Serbia, a very strategic area at the confluence of different rivers, as you know, on the middle Danube, which at the time was still under Byzantine control, but also having a lot of ties with the Gepids that would become essentially enemies of the Longobards in Pannonia and likely hosted some of these Herulian refugees, accordingly. So this Danubian Heruli are believed to have originally migrated, we'll see it was a bit of a tortuous path, but still, from essentially today's Ukraine, during the late 3rd or early 4th century. Why do we say this? Because, of course, we do think, as we will see now, that they had come from Scandinavia, together with other groups, mostly like what we call, in a broader sense, the Goths, descending from, essentially rising up the Vistula River that descended the Dnieper, one end settling this Pontic kingdom, from which the same Heruli, in fact, mounted up naval expeditions against Greece, Roman Greece. We are essentially the late 3rd, early 4th century, and that's also the Pontic area, the one where this group is first identified in Greek as Eluri, right? We will see all the specific sources later, but as a general introduction here, it's important to stress, because there are lots of uncertainties regarding probably the historicity of at least the connection between different groups of Heruli, or even in this case, something that eventually later historians in, say, the late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, sort of, connected themselves with the Heruli, but without any other specific proof. Also with this apparent either misspelling or respelling of the name. This group of the Eluri were reported to have lived specifically near the Azov Sea. Between 267 and 270, this group participated, along with the Goths and other peoples, in two significant raids into the Roman provinces in the Balkans and the Aegean Sea, attacking not only by land, but notably also by sea, which was a bit the characteristic of these populations. You would be surprised how there was even a sort of Frankish odyssey at this time, and these groups were sort of roaming all around, if not like the entire bulk of the people, at least some war bands, but in the case of the Heruli, at least these ones apparently doing so exactly from their nests in the eastern Black Sea. The association of these Eluri with the Heruli has been made by, as we were hinting at before, several later Byzantine authors, and remains, however, widely accepted. reason for which some scholars have recently, and in my opinion correctly, at least arisen the problem, like the issue of, really asserting that these groups were essentially what we define as the Heruli, and especially what their original homeland may have actually been, because there is this idea of essentially an Eastern Germanic branch that would have ended up essentially in Ukraine, together with the Goths, etc., and the possibility, we've seen it also with the Rugi, that are a bit less documented, but if you cross out this Eluri thing, like they're really similar to the Heruli at this point, may have actually come down from a more Western direction, where we also find them at some point. Together with, again, the Longbirds, the Skiri, etc., that seem to have had exactly this kind of multiple paths, at least some of these peoples. Especially, I would say, the smaller ones, because it's possible that different groups would have simply followed the bigger ones and be, in this sense, more prone to split. Also because they would lack critical mass in that regard, and so that would be the reason why we find them scattered a bit here and there. But still, the fact that they maintain their own ethnonym, at least apparently, here we are always, for these specific peoples, in the most of the times in the realm of speculation, but still stress is particularly evident during the migration in the Germanic world, their own sort of quality, their robustness. And the Heruli, as we'll see now, had earned over the centuries a reputation of savagery, but also of effectiveness. For example, the only actual legitimate connection that we have, this is true for most Germanic peoples, even when we understand that they were actually, or likely, if you don't have like the most precise information, originally of Scandinavia, is the fact that in the 6th century, the Heruli crushed by the Longbirds would come back to Scandinavia, where they thought to have been originated, and the source explicitates that. But for the rest, like, we do not know before the Black Sea location, even assuming it's the same group, anything about their prior history. And so we have just to mostly think that they had followed more or less the same Gothic trail, and so they had come at least from the Baltic. Additionally, there are proposals suggesting the existence of different Herulian kingdoms in various parts of Europe as early as the 3rd or the 4th century. Potentially, and likely, I would add, because I was discussing it just the other day in that video about late antiquity. There is this notion, it's not even just about this, it's a broader method, like if there's no explicit evidence of this, we never can say that, because it's dangerous that could be the case. You gotta appreciate, as I'm constantly doing myself right now, that we do not know, and I always stress that, but at least let's say that it's likely, because there aren't really any other, counters to this. Like, there aren't any major paths. But if you are familiar with the history of these individual peoples, you know that more or less they follow the same path, right? And it all points to Scandinavia. It's not like, I don't know, these guys came from Ethiopia or, India. So even if we don't have the precise explanation, I would say this is a characteristic of our sort of more continental school of history. It's not just this almost puritanic fixation with the precise, explicit certainty. Even if you had a source that literally stated that, like, it still would be dubious, right? But this doesn't make it less likely, right? So I would actually bet on their Scandinavian origin. But even so, even if they had aggregated, as they surely did, with other elements along the way, more or less still our understanding is that this originary core would have been, if not from Scandinavia, because some of these were Faggemeinschaften. They may have been literally created after they had crossed the Baltic into, say, the European mainland. But still, right, for those who are especially obsessed with genetic origins, we will also never have the explicit evidence, but we do not see much different options around. One hypothesis based on indirect evidence posits that there was a so-called Western Herulian settlement located, even probably as west as the Lower Rhine, which, as we'll see now, is not likely. In any case, one reason for this theory is that in 286 AD, only a few years after the Eastern raids that we were talking about before in the Aegean, the Heruli were listed as one of the peoples defeated in Gaul while attempting to cross the Rhine, which is plausible, right? But as we'll learn now, there is a bit of a misunderstanding regarding the term Batavian that was actually referred to a Pannonian settlement and not actually to the Lower Rhine Batavian people. So, like their occasional allies, the Goths, the Heruli soon began entering the Roman Empire, serving in its military after they were first noted in contemporary records as also Eastern European raiders. This is typically normal and very underrated in a general sense. It is to say these peoples, especially starting from the 3rd century, served in very consistent, in often picked groups in the Roman army. Right, they literally spent their entire life under the Roman banners. They came back home also with a distinct pride connected with the fact that they had been Roman soldiers, as well as being, in this case, like of Herulian, broader Germanic identity. We have plenty of these examples, and this tells you a great deal of how Romanized such groups were, at least in the awareness of the empire, its mechanisms, and the possibility of interacting with it. The Heruli do not seem to have been particularly Romanized in the sense that they stayed so long within properly Roman territory as other peoples later on, but surely some of them did. And here, as you have already understood, most of the problem with this Heruli is that they're not a big people, but for this reason they seem also to have been scattered here and there. And so we can't speak of any, say, majority bulk that we can simply track with certainty. The Heruli developed a particularly notable reputation as early as the 4th century, in Constantinian times, initially within the Western Roman Empire as soldiers. For example, a newly established Herulian unit was stationed in northern Italy, together with the local federati troops, like guarding the Alpine passes. Conversely, Heruli residing near the Roman frontiers were instead also among the numerous groups that contributed to the empire's disruption during this period. And surely there will have been, and this is typical for many other groups, even more the larger ones, but you see it even for how it tells a lot about the frequency of these clashes and how militarized they were, of course, clashing against their same kin, right? There surely were many Herulians fighting for the Romans and others, like fighting on their own, or other groups that killed each other during this period. It's likely that the Heruli had already settled north of the Danube by the 4th century, even though it's not clear whether these were the Eastern Heruli or some other branch coming from Northern Europe. In 409 AD, the Heruli were among the quote-unquote ferocious nations, predominantly from the Danubian area, that St. Jerome described as occupying all of Roman Gaul. Right? This refers, actually, there is some sort of license here. It refers to those peoples that have recently broken through the Rhine frontiers, also at the expenses of other Roman federati that had been settled along that frontier, such as the Franks, right? And that for a while would infest Gaul and Spain without sort of fixed settlement. However, it's interesting that Saint Jerome would tell us that there definitely was like an Herulian group that was sort of pushing west, right? Of course, if you look at those years, an important factor influencing the movements of such peoples was the the westward push of the Huns, which we'll deal with probably again soon, some more specific video. It's also about this, there is nothing really specific. Yes, some would have tried to escape, especially Eastern Europe, right? But say if there were some Central European Herulians, they would have tried to break through the frontiers to escape that Hunnic domination. In any case, we're talking about sort of smaller groups. Eventually, Attila's empire was centered, as you know, in the Danubian area. So this is the period in which similar populations like the Longobards, the Rugi, the Sciri, etc. would be, like basically anybody that wasn't within the Roman Empire, actually under the Huns. The Danubian Heruli kingdom mentioned in later records likely existed in some form within the same Attila's empire, right? As did the kingdoms, for example, the Ostrogoths, the Sciri, and the Gepids, even though we do not really know during Attila's times exactly the extent, even the exact location of these peoples, right? We started, adequately respot and correctly locate them in the European map through the Roman raider after Attila's empire was gone, and so these Germanic and also other ethnicities peoples began sort of to rule oneself once again, and directly, for example, with Constantinople. After Attila's death in 453, the Danubian Heruli participated to the famous Battle of Nedao in 454. It's a bit of a mythological battle, but it will have existed. This was the moment in which Attila's sons were defeated by at least this victorious part of Germanic, mostly Germanic subjects, while other Germans and other groups were still fighting for the Huns, right, including the Longobards apparently, and others. This battle breaks for good, like the Hunnic Empire, right? It's uncertain which side the Heruli actually supported, telling the truth. However, the fact that sort of they broke free at a point seems, in that Pannonian area, seems, with a dominion of some sort, seems to indicate that they were fighting against the Huns in some way, but we can't really say that. The Huns also participated in the following conquests of Italy by Odoacer, or at least they are found among the Italian soldiers under Odoacer that really didn't do anything to conquer Italy, was already there in 476. If anything, some Herulian bands joined Theodoric the Great in 489-93 against Odoacer, so settling in part in Italy. Also Naissus, at the time of the Gothic War in 554, we're towards the end, to finish crushing the Goths and or defending the peninsula from the Franks and the Alemanni. And probably also with the Longobards, that would have incorporated some of them, but also may have been joined by others that they had also crushed 60 years before, their descendants at least. We are in 568. This was sort of the largest migration in the era, and surely the Herulians would have participated to that as well. In any case, under Roman command, the Heruli played significant military roles in wars pretty much all across the Mediterranean at the time, on the Danube, in Africa, and Italy. However, as their last known kingdom in the Balkans eventually came under Roman domination, remember, more or less, we're talking the right bank of the middle Danube, more or less today's Serbia, and also smaller groups were integrated, absorbed into larger political entities such as the Gepids and the Longobards. These people, the Heruli, fade from historical records, right, around the same time of the Longobard conquest of Italy. and really most of their relevance as a single group, right, ended really at the beginning of the 6th century when the Longobards really crushed them. And so what you see later is mostly groups, war bands from this greater ensemble. It's interesting to think that the Danubian dominion may have been sort of a collection point of different heruli, also of different ancestry that hadn't really much to do with one another in historical perspective, but still, right, as a rallying point for further options emerging on the horizon from them. And during this era, the Middle Danube was also increasingly coming under the control of the Pannonian Avars. So if any heruli sort of survived, we've seen recently in a bit about the Pannonian Avars, how essentially all the outskirts of the Pannonian plains were subjugated by the Avars. These were smaller Germanic groups. We do not hear anymore that there are these Slavs accompanying the Avars as well, so a lot changes, and we do not know the Heruli anymore, right? But in the previous centuries, they had been a often heard name. When first mentioned by Roman authors in the 3rd century AD, these Heruli were referred to, interestingly enough, as Scythians, right? This is particularly true in the moment in which they were documented by Hellenic sources. The Byzantines had fundamentally this classicistic bias already at the time, whereby they would have called the peoples dwelling in certain areas in with the name of the peoples who had originally occupied the same territories in classical antiquity. So in the Pontic steppes there were the Scythians, and so there were the Scythians there, even if now there were lots of mostly Germano-Iranian peoples rather, because of this Nordic injection in the previous centuries. It's just like, I don't know, Annam Komnena calling the Franks the Celts, right, during the Crusades, and that's a bit like the same concept. It's not like, in fact, there weren't Iranian elements, and that the Germans descending along the Dnieper River wouldn't absorb lots of these literal Scythian, Sarmatian groups. However, there's something relatively different. Yes, they were sort of very similar to, in their facies, to the Reiter Völker, but in general, they had strong cavalry, etc., but in general, they did retain a more sedentary bias, right, compared to nomadic peoples. The use of the term Scythians for the Heruli and Goths alike likely began as early as the time of Dexippus, which is the same 3rd century AD. Most of those works have unfortunately been lost, though, so those would have been precious in a way. This also does not happen to help us, particularly regarding like broader ethnological and genetical information about this Heruli, by the way, not the Heruli. All right. Again, later authors began to call the Heruli and the Heruli the same people to draw the connections between them, but what did they actually know? Sure, there would have been many more sources around at the time. They may have known better than we do now. However, it's also like we don't think that was an incredible precision regarding these connections. During the later Roman Empire, imperial ethnographers classified Gepids, Vandals, Rugi, Skiri, also the Iranian Alans, and not only the Goths themselves as Gothic, in fact, or Getic peoples, right? And so the Heruli would have been part of this broader group, if anything, because they were located, if the Eluroi are exactly what we're interested in now. That the sense was that the Germans and the Goths were literally two different ethnicities, right? The Romans considered at a point the Germans of Northern Europe as a distinct people from this more sort of Irano-Germanic populations of Eastern Europe, the Pontic steppe. And in a sense, they were partially right. I mean, the Germans themselves did not literally redraw the ethnic map of Eastern Europe in fundamental ways, right? But still, they were the new rulers, co-opting Iranian groups that were integrated in their military. That's a part we should make a video about the Cimmerian kingdom and also the later Crimean Goths. They're a bit of a different thing. However, we never really venture into that. In any case, there are some scholars that note how the Heruli are consistently excluded from, for example, Procopius of Caesarea's lists of the so-called Gothic peoples, where in the 6th time of Justinian and the first, and there may have been of course, forgetfulness about all the various groups, but this is relevant because it's possible again that these Eluri were actually not the Heruli, right? There is, however, in the 11th century, the Byzantine author Zonaras, his work 1224-20, claiming that the Heruli were of Gothic stock. We do not know there what kind of sources he had. Like, it's likely that he may have written this out of, not of personal volition. Some other suggestion was not necessarily documented, and so it's possible that some authors would also consider if the Heruli were really among the gods in that Pontic context, so they wouldn't distinguish them from the gods, right? And so also the notion that, for example, the Greek Byzantine authors would have been more sensitive to this eastern side of the story because the gods were mostly their own thing, up to a certain point, especially during the raids from the Danube in the 3rd and 4th century. So they were more familiar with them, they would report them, whereas the Latin world would really not know, if anything, that the much better enucleated groups that we would know as the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, in my opinion, is not really of a great substance. And I am actually very captivated by the idea that it may have been a mistake, because that Eluroi is really just the only link that we have to this Eastern dimension. Even though I'm open, of course, to the fact that there may have actually been, we're sure of that, Herulian groups among that Eastern branch of the Germanic peoples. That, remember, were not even properly considered as Germanic by the Roman ethnographers at the time. They considered them Gothic, if anything, not the Germans of Central Europe. So today, of course, when we look at the Heruli in their better and later documented context, we understand they were likely Germanic, and they spoke Germanic. They are classified as a Germanic people. We'll understand better how and why. In any case, they are often associated to the East Germanic branch, right? At least most of the times, because also in here we're not fully certain. We call the Heruli in this way from the Hellenic Heruloi and the Latin Heruli. We do not know whether the H before the name has that is not present, especially in the Hellenic nomenclature, was an organic sound within the name of these people. We do not, unfortunately, have their point of view. In any case, we have in the earliest references to the Heruli this 4th century record referring to them, or at least as they would have been recognized as the Heruli later by Byzantine sources, are seen as the Eluri, with the, in fact, the L and the R reversed compared to later records. And it doesn't really give us great certainty about the accuracy of this connection was later made. The earliest author, Dexippus, describing this people, the Eluri at least, provides, interestingly enough, an Hellenic etymology for their name, which in a sense is indeed fascinating, but also a bit suspicious, because what kind of name was this then? Was it a Greek name bestowed upon by these almost Byzantine authors by this time? The etymology would be connected to the swamps, Helen, in Greek, right, which would fit with their Azov Sea coastal homeland. The interland. There is Meotia. It's a pretty marshy area around the Don estuary, especially think about the time without proper canalization, etc. So this does not sound particularly Germanic. In fact, this wouldn't have any origin of this kind. And this would be the case even if these people had been, say, I don't know, Scythian or some other ethnicity. So that when we look at the later term Heruli, which is properly attested, its Germanic origin has been analyzed, and it's been connected to the Germanic Erilats, that basically is the same one from which the modern English term Earl would stem from, which in this migration era case would imply that Heruli was an honorific military title in the Germanic language. And it's possible that being subjected to the gods, or at least gravitating around them, or at least bigger peoples, the Heruli may have gotten this sort of place of honor, right? And there is even a sort of speculation, especially if we want to make the Heruli this Eastern Germanic people, especially following the gods, that there wasn't much of a broader national ethnic identity in this name, but some sort of dynastic, aristocratic terminology, perhaps originally bestowed upon a brotherhood of sacred warriors of the kind of the comitatus, essentially, that we made many videos on, and that therefore would especially qualify some sort of picked unit, some quality, some elite troops that would have at some point won, however, a place in the establishment of other broader confederations. There is actually no proof of this, or at least the etymology would suggest something similar, but at least there is no expressed evidence. It's just an hypothesis that is being proposed. Some deny that, other... Yeah. But the sense is that there is a military connotation. There is something about hierarchy, quality forces of some kind that had won some nobiliar title of sort, which is also very interesting, because you can imagine, especially among these smaller peoples, some kind of rivalry of competition, right? Especially to be co-opted by the bigger guys, especially those who were already creating some sort of more monarchic direction. This is especially true for the Goths. Otherwise, if we want to associate the Heruli to the Sciri, to the Rugi, to the Longobards in particular, that sort of more like Pannonian Central European branch was not very stratified, right? The Gepids were. In that case, we think most of it was a more Eastern influence, some greater Hunnic, Gothic one. So everything is possible. But we also have to understand, crucially, when this name was first bestowed, because if we talk about the time of the Eluri, that is not even Heruli, we've literally given an Hellenic etymology, then it may be paradoxically more plausible because of the Gothic presence there. If we talk about later times, we're not sure where those Heruli really stem from, if they really were in the eye of the sort of Gothic or Hunnic storm at some point, or something more peripheral. We know, admittedly, that those other groups, like the Longobards, etc., were heavily, affected. Let's say they received a lot from the Hunnic sort of autocrat. Even in their names, they sort of appreciated being co-opted by those more powerful peoples, but they still were from this Central European context, also with strong northern European roots still at the time, much less stratified. And so we do not fully understand, at least at this point, whether the Heruli were more like an oligarchic people, some sort of, if they had a more tribal, especially considering their size, that is fairly small sort of profile. Some scholars went as far as looking at the aforementioned Herula's etymology in comparison to something that could be found in Scandinavia. For example, on the Futhark inscriptions, Herular has been spotted as a possibly connected term that would have even indicated some sort of werewolves. So, in part matching with that sense of elite war bands, especially in this time in Germanic history, we've made multiple videos explaining the actual rise and fall of the Berserkers, Ulfednars. Yet this is only just a mere hypothesis. We do not find any other explicit connection. The Heruli, of course, would have attributed a great importance to their ethnonym, so it does appear this more nobiliar title, this of earls of some sort, to have had, like, naturally not in the later feudal sense, but broader quality again, rank as broader people out there, really being a source of really great reputation. Some attested Heruli names within them are also very Germanic, by the way. They also resemble Gothic names. They do not really, however, fit necessarily in any specific branch, especially of the Germanics, that, as you know, were divided between different groups: the Western, the Elbe, the Eastern, the Northern, which is also somehow normal. In any case, this may point to, if anything, some Gothic influence, but not necessarily like a full dwelling to a Gothic context. And again, in my opinion, the Heruli connection distances itself ever more. It's possible that the Heruli were more strictly Nordic at the time of their later appearance as Heruli proper, like to have had not necessarily abandoned Scandinavia a short time before, but being among those peoples who had just moved from a relatively short time from at least the Baltic shores, short time, maybe a couple of centuries, but still having maintained a bit more of a defiled position, and having made themselves known just because of these war bands around, which may have actually been the reason of their Herlat's appellative. The Heruli are, however, in any case, whether we accept their Azov Sea settlement or a more directly sort of northern than central European origin, being originary of the Baltic Sea, which would have migrated from there, proper from Scandinavia, the original nucleus, and then possibly again to these other directions. Even if it had moved to the Black Sea, this would have occurred before the 3rd century AD. The Rugirs somehow similar to the Heruli. They were their neighbors on the Danube. And they, as we've seen recently, they are also believed to have originated on along the southern Baltic shore. In that case, having originally been very close to the Goths, but also in this case not really known if they had followed them or they had remained a bit more in the north. This was absolutely normal. There were, even among the Goths and other peoples, like others being left behind, some properly in Scandinavia, but others also along the way, or taking different paths. So we do think the Heruli having originated from Scandinavia anyway. we see mostly at least this Gothic connection, and that's the most likely thing in any case. The source of the idea that such people specifically hailed from Scandinavia, as you know, is reinforced by the 6th century historian Jordanes, who was based in Constantinople but had specific knowledge of some, at least Germanic, historical background, some of which is, we know it was openly made up for specifically political reasons, the way the Goths were being handled by the empire at the time. Anyhow, he believed that both the Goths and the Gepids originated from Scandinavia, many centuries before his own time. Famously enough, Scandinavia was defined quasi officina gentium aut certe velut vagina nationem, so literally like a workshop, or even better, the womb of nations. This is a trope we find in different ethnographic works, and it's mostly connected to the idea that Scandinavia was not too appealing place, that it was subjected routinely to this sort of Malthusian cycles, whereby the local resources were too scarce at a point to simply feed people that were sent in waves towards the outer side. We will talk, if you want, at some point about the early Germanic migrations, but you know what we're talking about since the Cimbrian, the Teutonist, and beyond. And this narrative naturally proved highly influential for later writers, but there is no really need to try to undermine it. Again, yes, Jordanes was not, we know that, like saying correct things all the time, but he also made specific remarks regarding the Heruli, right? These comments have been a bit challenging to interpret. It's part of his ambiguity in many ways. For example, Jordanes states that the Heruli had been driven out of their own settlements in Scandinavia by the Danes, literally Herulos propris sedibus expulerent. This assertion has been interpreted by various scholars in at least two ways, and this is fascinating. So some basically came up with the idea that the Heruli would have been specifically originary to some places in today Denmark or southern Sweden, or in between, especially in the islands in between. The other is that this so the Heruli would have been more recently displaced from Scandinavia than this early Germanic period, and so something actually closer to Jordanes' times. This would support the notion that the Eluroi would have had nothing to do with the Heruli, and that the latter would have simply migrated straight from, say, the Baltic to the Danube without passing, at least if not through various warbands in other places, as a major people bulk. Historians also note that Jordanes mentions the Rugi in the same passage concerning Scandinavia. And the Rugi, as we've just seen, were neighboring the Heruli on the Danube. They also had recently been destroyed by Odoacer and fully cleared from Pannonia by the Longobards, or at least assimilated some of them. The Heruli were also crushed by the Longobards. So this connection is fascinating, because just as for the Rugi, we do not have, other the Eluroi thing, any reason to think that the Heruli may have ventured too far east, even particularly early in time, right? So this leaves really open the general debate on the origin, the geographical origin of the Heruli. Other very important source is actually Procopius, because not just he is contemporary to Jordanes, but as we've seen, he does not link the Heruli that he knew with the Goths, right? And he recounted specifically of at least a Herulian nobleman migration to Scandinavia from the Middle Danube. Scandinavia here is named as Thule, right? And this is after, as we said, the Herulian kingdom had been destroyed by the Longobards. This, of course, aligns in part with Jordanes because of the sort of back and forth from the perceivedly originary homeland. It's even said that when other expatriates from the Danubian kingdom established themselves further south in the Balkans, so in Byzantine territory, this is also how the Byzantines would have learned these peoples better. This is true for other, I don't know, also the Gepids at some point when were crushed by the Longobards and the Avars, took refuge at Constantinople. Was now an habitual practice, especially for Eastern Germanic peoples. They found themselves in the need of a ruler. And so what the Heruli do here is sending an embassy to the Scandinavian Heruli and returning with one actual leader. This is fantastic because it shows how, first of all, like they would have faith in the ancestral sort of connection as far as their government, also in exile, was concerned. How this was not like a hyper powerful king of sort, but still, of course, a powerful chieftain of some sort. And it does tell a lot about this Scandinavian connection. This suggests also, in my opinion, that the origin of this group was sort of much closer to Scandinavian time than probably the original Elroy, right? That would have really had, like, we don't hear, for example, the Goths doing something like that. We know the Goths at some point, I don't know, sent embassies to the Finns, but say these connections with Northern Europe were there in many cases, but that the Heruli would have sort of abandoned the Baltic in the 3rd century AD, and still by 6th they would have this necessity of having, especially if they had passed towards the, say, through the Pontic dominion, etc., just need to have a ruler from Scandinavia. Well, it's not entirely clear, right? It's not also like who were the Heruli that lived in Scandinavia at that point. Really, that were also just the relics of the same people that was recently crushed, that had come back there. Was there, in fact, a truly Herulian basis there? It's possible both were the case. Some scholars are also skeptical, in any case, of this strong ties with the North, at least in a meaningful political sense. They, for example, note that Procopius states that the Heruli relocated to Scandinavia left the home of their ancestors. Thus, the source does not quite say that Scandinavia was the originary fatherland, but this Danubian kingdom. There is also a general, say, understanding that, however, the Heruli were likely of Scandinavian origin, given their material culture, at least broadly fitting with the Germanic one. It's hard to assume that they ventured so far north without a reason for such nature. For example, this is pointed out, but it really depends on what kind of options they would have had in the first place. It's actually a good point, right? I do believe that there was a connection with Scandinavia. Other scholars sort of rejected, but it's possible again that there were less Heruli in Scandinavia than those that actually fled from Central Europe once their dominions were destroyed. It's a sort of backward migration. Admittedly, we don't have too much evidence of this happening, but we do know of connections existing between Northern Europe and pretty much all the rest. Not just, of course, during the Germanic era, but especially because the Scandinavian origin of many of these groups, and especially their elites, have far-reaching contacts at this point, still having to coordinate migrations, especially inviting other peoples, for example. This is true, in fact, not just because of the individual confederacy, but also for other elements that could always sort of join. So we will see this in other circumstances. Everything was still quite mobile at the beginning of the 6th century, so that makes sense. There is an interesting scholar that I like, that is Ellegert, advocating the view that the expulsion of the Heruli involved immigrants whose true homeland was on the Danube instead. This is basically a scholar asserting that the entire notion of the Eluroi is wrong, and that also this Scandinavian origin is to be, if not rejected, at least it's not substantiated, and that fundamentally we would be sure that there were some Heruli for, like, especially in the first half of 6th century Scandinavia, perhaps as a sort of exactly of like as refugees from the Danubian kingdom that had been just destroyed. The same Ellegard says that the Heruli were a loose group of Germanic warriors which came into being in the late 3rd century in the region north of the Danube, that the authors fixed mostly the idea of a Central European ethnogenesis of some sort. This is not so wrong, meaning that even if the Heruli were originally, say, from Scandinavia at large as a group, but they migrated to the Baltic and even followed the eastern path, they would have at some point been established as a political group. This is mostly how these Germanic communities did, especially when they entered the continental Central European mid-grinder, because Scandinavia was sensibly less warlike than Central Europe. That's where probably Botanism had stemmed from, also from the broader Indo-European migrations. There were more resources, and these peoples were sort of more like also pressuring each other because of this continuous Scandinavian output, which entailed the necessity of devoting themselves to a tutelar deity, being more warlike, compact, militaristic people of some sort, just to survive in there. It's so the possibility that the Heruli may have just, again, stemmed from this 3rd century group gradually migrating to the Danube, but not really reaching as far as the Black Sea, is really possible. I don't see much of a problem with that. I very much like Ellegard's proposition. But going back to what we know, speaking of the Eluroi, we have this further ambiguity regarding to the various campaigns they participated to. In 267-68 and in 69-70, Roman authors, mostly from the Greek side of the empire, describe 2 significant campaigns by this Eluri into the Balkans and the Aegean, so rich areas to plunder, especially in the latter, by sea. Right? These were probably the largest seaborne raids launched from the northern Black Sea coast that had already begun in the 50s of the 3rd century. Remember, here it's the 3rd century crisis. Essentially, it's this Gothic rather than the Germanic people to pressure on the Roman frontier, right, and creating most problems, especially in the east, right. That's also what part triggers the Illyrian emperors to rise, because they were more directly threatened by these groups. And it's also relevant that the Roman East was this permeable, differently actually from the West, that at that point was better sheltered. So this puts in perspective sometimes also some ideas about the later success of the eastern part and so on. In any case, there was just so much that they could do. These were raids. They were not expeditions aiming at permanent territorial conquest. Nevertheless, they were quite damaging overall. Again, later authors simply equated this Eluroi to the Danubian Heruli, to the later Danubian Heruli. There's the Augustan history written in the late 4th century that describes mostly the 2nd and 3rd century Roman history. Jordanus, as we've seen in the 6th century, and George Syncellus. These are Byzantine authors, the latter more or less living at the time of Charlemagne's, simply stating and thus giving rise to the historiographical notion that these Eluroi were just Heruli. The Heruli that we meet on the Danube in later times. So Goths, Eluri, other so-called Scythian people seized control of many Hellenic centers along the Black Sea. They put together this fleet that they used to raid initially in the Pontus of Xenus itself, eventually crossing the straits and reaching Hellas, and devastating, of course, also Anatolia, mostly on the coast, because those were historically like the richest areas, right, of the Hellenic civilization. There are doubts regarding the timeline. Some scholars say that these last incursions, the most devastating ones, began during the reign of Gallienus. I made a video, if anything, about his sort of alleged military reforms. We are between 206 and 68. And that they continued at least until 269. We are at this point under the reign of Marcus Aurelius Claudius, better known as Claudius Gothicus because of the later victory over these Goths, as we will see now at Naissus. The problem is that we have apparently two different campaigns, at least according to some scholars. I think they may have been the same. And in fact, there is not really a certainty. So in 267, Elroy fleet departed from the Azov Sea, navigating past the Danube Delta. So basically, they passed the northern coast of the Black Sea. They reached the Bruges, and then they went down along the Thracian coast up to the Straits of the Bosphorus. In fact, they captured the same Byzantium, the later Constantinople, also Chrysopolis, before eventually withdrawing back again home in the Black Sea. Just think about this attitude, because you know that at the time of the Varangians, of the Kievan Rus, more or less the same things were happening. Also because of this Northern European connection there with the Vikings, mixed with the locals, right, at different times. Here the Iranians mostly, and here the Slavs. Then this essentially pirates appear again, spawn again. They raid Kyzikos. I made a video about the Battle of Kyzikos in antiquity before these times, more than half of a millennium before. But just to tell you, to make you understand more or less the same operational theaters, more or less what this could have entailed strategically and logistically. Naturally, in a very different time, but still, the geography is the same. Subsequently, they entered the Aegean Sea through the Dardanelles. And so they began to create issues in places as Lemnos, Skyros, Imbros, reaching the Peloponnese, where they landed. So much so that they plundered not only Sparta, for example. It was the closest, at least largest city to their landing site, but also Corinth, Argos. Literally, they toured the entire Peloponnese. They also profanate the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. So this, especially from a Greek or Roman perspective, is quite disturbing, because these were some of the most important cities in classical antiquity. There was a lot of pride also for the Romans to have simply controlled them, and so that it was a big deal for the local to see that the empire could simply not protect them at this point. Still within the year 267, the Elroy, and it's again this other group, the Goths, the so-called Scythians in general, reached the same Athens, right? And sort of an overlooked aspect of the Roman Empire is that actually local militias next to the legionnaires and the auxiliaries, the military proper, right, existed. All right, so Athens was defended by local forces. However, the city falls anyway. In fact, this is interesting as well. These militias are not enough to stem this concentrated forces. Again, these were very warlike peoples. They had that aggressive mentality, moral load, and so on. Consider that Athens had been recently provided with a new wall at the time of Valerian, and so we're talking a generation before. In spite of this, of course, the invaders could not be stopped, because walls are not just what stops an enemy army. This event prompted a renowned defense by the same Dexuppos. That is the same guy who eventually wrote about the Eluroi. That was so important for later historians, but really knowing in part who these guys were, interestingly enough. He may have actually had pretty mixed and confused notions about the origins of these peoples. We've seen that he, again, attributes to this Eluroi a specifically Hellenic etymology. It's not like the Greeks were necessarily biased in that xenophobic direction, normally, to also appropriate sort of themselves of who were these peoples. They mostly fit an Hellenic world that is allegedly free even within the Roman Empire. Further north, in 268, we have Gallienus defeating the Heruli at the river Naissus, using a newly developed mobile cavalry. This is a bit of a myth, but I'd say the Roman army was a hell of an army, and in any case was transforming itself regardless of individual autocratic reformers. There was one of these barbarian chiefs, like apparently an Herulian, if we are to identify the same Eluroi, named Naulobatus, becoming the first barbarian recorded in Britain history to receive actually the imperial insignia from the same Romans, attaining the rank of a Roman consul. Right? So what actually happened at this point, in I made a video about this, about the first islands of Germanic soldiers, Germanic people in general settled in the Roman Empire, also highlighting the 3rd century crisis, mutual need for manpower and labor force that were, even as defeated peoples that had attacked the empire, essentially converted, right, to civilization, made Romans, and essentially enlisted in the imperial army. This is very, very interesting, and it reflects, in fact, a dynamic that had, telling the truth, been going on for a long time, because almost as soon as the Romans and the Germans met, there were Germanic forces fighting for the Romans as well. And at least here we're not sure whether we're talking the Heruli proper, but it's still a beginning, and also the later group would do exactly the same thing. Some scholars suggested that there were 2 distinct campaigns, one in 269 and 270. The Byzantine historians of the later times said, perhaps exaggerating, that this Gothic force, this Scythian force, scrapped together something like thousands of ships, which is a bit unlikely, departing from the mouth of the Dnieper River, which is not unlikely said, but consider that later Byzantines would have also been familiar with the places, and using so many different groups for the expedition, including, and this is a mix of, in fact, sort of relatively earlier people such as the Peuci. You have also a mix of the Greutungi and the Ostrogothi, for example, which is interesting because technically they should have been the forefathers, more or less, of the others. The Turbingi, that would have been, and the Vesi, that, again, they were paired because this would have been the later Visigoths, that, as you know, the Ostrogoths were called mostly later, from 16th century Italian historiography, like the ones of Cassiodorus with Theodoric. The Italian ones were the Goths proper, and the West Goths were the Visigoths, or at least even later. That's how the names were eventually affiliated. But there would have been these Gepids, Celts. Celts may have been here some people living in today's Poland, Ukraine, that were in fact the easternmost European Celts. As you know, the Bastardni, that also record later, were thought to be a Celto-Germanic people of some sort. There's an ambiguity there. Those would become, they would be absorbed by these other groups. And these other Heruli, at least for the later Byzantine authors that at that point are sure that the Eluroi were Heruli, or at least they decided to make this association. It may be simply that they copied one another without much of a more specific certainty. These forces would have essentially split into 2 contingents in the Hellespont, which is also normal considering the overall lack of control units among these kind of confederal groups. We'll surely deal more with the Germanic confederacies at some point, because we have really to take care of some, even the most concrete power foundations of these groups. But it was normal for them to say, okay, well, there is not really a unified command, there is a recognized ruler, but then something goes in another direction. And one contingent attacked Thessaloniki, where the Romans, now led by Emperor Claudius, achieved a major victory at the Battle of Naissus, Niš, Serbia, in 269. Then there is this different battle of Naissus, which some scholars consider to have been a separated one. There is some suspect that it was actually the same story. As you understand, this later Roman historiography is often not so limpid, especially considering that we're talking areas that did not have at least an overwhelming historiographical, say, focus, especially on the frontier. If anything, as we've seen, warfare came their doorstep, or actually beyond those. Nevertheless, we have this information that, again, an Illyrian chieftain named Antonobalus is said to have defected to the Roman side, similarly to what we've seen before, this joining of the Roman military from the side of these barbarians. Then there is a second group that would have sailed instead towards Rhodes, Crete, Cyprus, so they made their sort of Greek vacations, with many Goths and Illyrians managing to return safely to harbor in Crimea at the end of it. There are minor attacks, of course, different pirates continuing to roam around until 276. Consider this, we are in the heat of probably the 3rd century crisis. This weren't actually even just the most important problems the Romans were coping with, but if you consider essentially a generation of raids that were going under at this point, and for the first time in Roman history, like an incapacity to essentially to stop them after time piracy had disappeared in Pompey's and Caesar's time. Now, the Heruli, if we want to track them to this Eastern European branch, would have been, in that case, part of the so-called Chernyakhov culture, which is an archaeological culture flourishing between the 2nd and the 5th century AD, in this wide area of what is today's eastern part of Central Europe. So more or less today's Ukraine, Romania, Moldova, and parts of Belarus. This area was mostly dominated by the Goths and other Germanic peoples. We know of the Bastardnae, in part also the Dacians, the Carpians. These are important groups because you know that at this point Aurelian also abandons at some point Dacia and establishes the same province south of the Danube. From the north, we talked about this context in a very watched video about especially the origins of the Romanian peoples, looking at the precocious barbarization, say, of Dacia, but still the survival of some Romance elements all around, especially in the mountains. So if we decide to track the Heruli in this area, regardless of whether they're being the Illyrians or, say, at least let's decide that they were initially in this eastern tract before they reached the Danubian area, well, they would have basically been indistinguishable from the Goths. So slightly different from the type of broader, Germanic, Central European material culture that we see in the Danubian basin at the beginning of the 6th century. Jordanus says that these Illyrians from the Azov area in the late 4th century were conquered by the Greutungian Goths, king Ermanaric. This is relevant because it would essentially show, even assuming this information is correct, that were the Illyrians the Heruli, this would have enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy for a long time in Eastern Europe, regardless of the powerful Gothic confederation. So they would have been hegemonized by the Goths, but not really conquered. By the way, at this point, things are heating up because of the arrival of the Huns. Ermaneric's realm is something we discussed in the video about the Ostrogoths. At this time, again, mostly identifiable in their origin with this Greutungian tribe that may have stretched really far and wide, right, encompassing Finns, Slavs, Alans, Sarmatians. Again, this is not for today's video, but it's important to show, let's say, how powerful the Goths were as the most successful of the Germanic peoples also, before and after the Hunnic wave. There is an interesting information by Jordanus telling us that before the Gothic conquest, the Heruli were led by a king named Alaric. Right, and some scholars went on to suggest that the future Visigothic king, Alaric I, which is truly the first real king in a truly, at that point, Romano-Germanic sense, after which basically all the others sort of modeled their kingdoms, may have been named after this Herulian king. And this is relevant because also the etymology of Alaric, which means essentially the ruler of the world, because it comes from old and Rick in that sense of Reich, of powerful in as a ruler, right? Rich and far-ranging as a ruler. In this case, which would make one of the most important, characters in Romano-Germanic history, essentially being named after an Herulian king. But also about this, we're not, particularly informed, other than what Jordanus said, that again shouldn't be taken as the Bible, because we know that many of these stories were made up just a bit to comfort, from a Byzantine perspective, a Germano-Byzantine perspective, essentially the role of the Goths specifically into the empire at that point. And again, this is precious information, you shouldn't dismiss it, but just be aware that it may be just notionism. And that's just what we have. As we've seen, the Heruli were known in the West at a point, just as the Goths also in the West, before the arrival of Attila, both as enemies and friends of Rome, some simply raiding the empire, others instead enlisting in the Roman army, or both things at some point. So we understand that this group at least may have been around, not just in the east, or at least moving from there, possibly. In 286, Claudius Mamertinus tells that Maximian's victory over a group of Heruli and Caibonus, the latter a people known only from the single report, that had been attacking Gaul, apparently thus coming from a non-Roman land of Central Europe at that point. We are in the late 3rd century, so it's a pretty early time. Claudius Mamertinus, by the way, is a source writing from the essentially from the second half of the 6th century. So it's not like a contemporary source, but it's still an interestingly mention of the Heruli for that early and especially Western context. We have subsequent reports of the Heruli in the western half of the empire into the 4th century, which, according to some, would have led even to the settlement of some Heruli on the lower Rhine. Again, we have no idea of any connection with the Black Sea Heruli, and there may be actually a mistake here we will explain later. There is the fact that the Heruli on the Danube would have settled specifically in Passau, which at the time was known as Castra Batava, because in the 2nd century AD the Romans had stationed there a Batavian auxiliary cohort. And so the notion that the Heruli would have been close to the Batavians doesn't actually refer to the Netherlands, but to this Danubian context, so a quite different thing. In any case, it is absolutely correct to presume that there were these Herulian bands around, also because we find them in the Notitia Dignitatum, properly as an auxiliary unit. Right, the Romans established, in fact, such force within the Western Roman Empire. We have it documented. I have also the insignia here among the, it's just old circles in the pictures. So this is nothing specifically to do with any Herulian settlement on the Rhine per se. If anything, they would have tried to break through. But as we know, it's not like we think of other peoples that sort of try to break through the Rhine that eventually remain, who were simply stopped there. Except the Burgundians, in any case, not so small like the Heruli, to have simply, established a seigneury there. I mean, it's possible, but we don't have that kind of information. Plus, the Heruli seniores, we were saying before, this unit registered in the Roman army, was stationed in northern Italy. So we even have an idea where these guys would have sort of eventually settled down. These were just to eventually blend into the local Italian army, and or just as colonists, as farmers, etc. This numerus Herulorum, genitive plural, numerus of the Heruli, was apparently a lightly kept unit, often associated also with the Batavi seniores. So there is a further associations to the Batavians, but it doesn't seem to have had much to do with an actual Herulian settlement on the lower Rhine. Right. By the way, if we have the Heruli seniores, logic should be that there should have been also some Heruli juniores, which is a way again for the Romans to call certain units. Some have suggested that it may have been part of the Eastern Roman army, and disappeared after the Roman disaster at Adrianople in 378. Again, all hypotheses, but it's definitely possible that some Heruli were in Roman service in the Eastern Roman Empire, and they fought and died from the Roman side at the Battle of Adrianople, right? And if you believe in the eastern branch of the Heruli, you can think, of course, there were some of them from the what would eventually become the Visigothic side in that major clash. We'll talk about the Battle of Adrianople sooner or later. Of course, the circle shrinks at some point, but there is so much. We just began to talk about this stuff. There is a very precious source that we mentioned for the Rugi that discusses also the Skir, for example, that is the Laterculus Veronensis. This is from Constantine's time, like dating around the 314. It essentially lists the barbarian peoples residing within the Roman Empire, which is very interesting, as this is before the major settlement of entire barbarian peoples, such as the aforementioned Visigoths after Adrianople, that, as you know, is a bit like the watershed. And again, in the wake of other videos we made explaining how it was just habitual practice for the Romans to settle these groups, naturally in more diluted ways, before Adrianople, in fact, in what the Visigoths would have been, was already a very important practice, especially starting from the 3rd century, both for the lack of manpower, the need for the Symmacharides troops from outside the frontiers, considering the broader gentrification of the Roman military, at least of the native populations within, if we can so say, within the empire, and raids, and so actual battles, as we've seen before, in which the same Heruli may have been defeated and in fact settled as colonists. So it was, from a Roman perspective, like the single greatest thing. Like as you know, also later on, especially because of the Gothic problem, the entire Theodosian propaganda like emphasized this fact that the Germans had been effectively like brought under Roman obedience, and now they were turning to Romans, into soldiers and farmers, and so the imperial Catholic power had triumphed over them. So there are chances that the Danubian Heruli existed as early as the 4th century. This is what, for example, the aforementioned Ellegard believes. This scholar proposes that, in fact, the settlement was so early, it was criticized by other scholars. The location would have been more or less the same. So the stretch of the Danube from Passau to Vienna, so mostly through like it's today's easternmost German most important settlement, at least along the Danube, and the entire Lower Austria, more or less. Then, of course, the exact territorial boundaries are a bit difficult to trace. Yet, it's of course like they control these strongholds over the river that would confer them some power. The main criticism to Ellegard's chronology stem from those issues. For example, the Rugi are listed by some sources together with the Heruli somewhere between literally the Celts of the British Isles and the tribes of the Lower Rhine. Nobody really understands what's the point. With the Rugi, we have seen that this may actually be something like they may have been Scandinavian pirates of some sort that exactly in those years were roaming the North Sea. Here, the connection with the Lower Rhine would, if anything, bring us yet again close to the idea that there was some Heruli settled next to the Batavians in that region. We do not know better than that. It's just an hypothesis, but we don't have there the full evidence. So it's all like this information is all pretty scanny. It's literally all we have, and we can't sort of confirm it. But even if that had been the case, doesn't necessarily mean that the Heruli as a whole would have just been stationed there. Maybe these were just war bands, like in the case of the Rugi, that, as we've seen, were a bit parceled here and there. And it's possible that their Danubian settlement actually was that early as the Constantinian era. In 360, Constantius II ordered the future Emperor Julian, who at the time commanded forces in Gaul, we made a video about the Battle of Vercingetorix, to send some of his picked troops, including the Heruli, the Batavi, and others, to fight against the Parthians in Mesopotamia. This is interesting because it, if anything, shows that those were not Roman. I mean, we have seen that these were Roman troops now, so they weren't technically entire groups of peoples that were simply settled there. I mean, the Batavians had historically, of course, lived into the empire, but the Heruli really not, right? And we do not have evidence of any particular breakthrough unless we think that those early incursions in the 3rd century in Gaul may have brought to some groups like just established as also the Roman units. This is also interesting because we do not have a clear understanding of whether these foreign numeri in the Roman army were something like just people. I mean, there were probably both. Some were local settlers that owed certain type of military service as sort of mini forces, like regiments, for example, or even smaller units. And others would have been instead some roamers, some people who just lived in the army and then would come back to the barbaricum once they were discharged in a way. So this thing is not really clear, right? And this may have nothing to do with even the Danubian Heruli, or at least there may not be any specifically direct connection, especially if we think that these were bands and not an entire people. But as you understand, something aligns here and there. So the scattering of the Heruli would sort of make sense, especially if, given their attempted Germanic etymology, they were considered as some sort of but not necessarily special forces, but a picked body of troops that from a Germanic people particularly known for their military prowess, right? There are other peoples out there, like, for example, the Alani, that were apparently much more performing than the Germans. They managed, even if less, and following the trail of other Germanic groups, to emancipate themselves from them when they were in Gaul. I made a couple of videos about this. Again, we don't really know, but the notion that there would have been a major Herulian people in Gaul or around the Rhine, it's not really supported by any specific evidence. In 366, the Batavian and the Herulian units fought against the Alemanni near the Rhine, under the command of Carietto, who fell in battle, and subsequently against the Picts and Scots in Britain. So, some globetrotters and some reliable units that would have seen really extensive action and would have gained a major military reputation. They were later dispatched to fight the Persians on the eastern frontier, which would actually point to more like the military unit direction rather than some sort of local settlers. Because at that point, yes, these units were relatively mobile, but assuming that they were followed by an actual group of, say women, children, etc., like in a migration situation, like they would have been punished for, being moved, even for, emergential reason in the east, because they would have not likely come back. So again, the notion that there would have been a significant Herulian concentration in Gaul or the Rhine frontiers, other than this numeri, from a strictly military point of view, is not really backed by any evidence. As we were remembering before, in 405-6, there was a major breakthrough of barbarian groups across the Rhine, which really brought a vogue into Roman Gaul. This was a major watershed in the migration era, as you know, because since then, basically, the Romans weren't able to protect anymore certain parts of the West, starting especially from the northern part of Britain, northern Gaul. And the Heruli appear, as we were saying, according to the historian Jerome, in the list of such invaders, showing us, if anything, that there was some eastern settlement compared to the Rhine. We do not know exactly the veridicity also of this statement. We know that, of course, these are the same years in which the Huns were about to arrive, so it's a pretty tense situation across the frontier. We know, of course, groups that could move quite quickly across Europe, right? We have this idea that, in fact, the migrations of these major peoples lasted for centuries because they were really part of a gradual movement, but especially towards this time, like if one people decided to move all across Europe like any other major force, they could do that, right? They didn't go slow across the centuries because it literally took them that long to do it. It's just like the political balance wouldn't make them try anything speedier. In 435, the Heruli are mentioned by Sidonius Apollinaris in his letter 7, in the lines from 23 to 240, which is actually an interesting and substantial account describing them as troops of General Naissus that had spent time in exile with the Danubian Huns. That's where the Danubian connection comes interesting, because that's why also Ellegard states that the Heruli were pretty early located in essentially between Passau and Vienna, so close to the Huns, by the way, but already there when these arrived, right? Hence the Passau as Castra Batava that would associate them with the Batavians as a sort of misunderstanding. What would have happened here is that some forces would have come back there, right? Because that was their land now. So even if they were fighting for the Romans in Gaul, and as we've seen, some of them had been brought to the east, and now there were important upheavals, including their Danubian possessions overrun or at least controlled by the Huns. Some of these Romano-Germanic soldiers would come back to their ancestral land, into, say, ancestral, because now that's where their realm, let's call it in this way, would have been located, and dealt with the Hunnic issues, right? That mostly were cooperative, regardless of course, of the tensions, the fact that, as we've seen later, they may have participated to the same Hunnic demise or not, for that matter. So this is unfortunately unknown. We can't see through most of all this, but this gives you a dimension of how, if anything, cross-European, you can argue, that this people really was. I mean, these were troops at least habituated to move from Scotland to Persia, earning a massive military reputation. This may have actually been just a trait of theirs, this capacity to simply serve as some major, measurably expert and practical warbands that had earned such high military reputation and experience, but still being independent, right? Serving the empire, also having groups harassing it. But because of all that story of the Aluroid actually not being necessarily, having ever necessarily interfered with the Roman Empire in a major sense, right? And so I personally very much tend to separate those Aluroid that really seem to be an Hellenic invention by name. I mean, not that they did not exist, but they were not the later Heruli. That maybe the Byzantines sort of fell by assonance, simply fell into mistake by equating them. Whereas in the later centuries, we have this more straightforward connection with the Danube that, if anything, is highlighted only in the early 6th century, right around there, but that you see here from other sources seem to reappear, and having to do perhaps with, again, those positions along the Danube of the major bulk of the people. What is interesting about the Heruli in the sense is that they don't seem even to have been particularly eastern, even along the Danube. I mean, if you pick, here I can pick a picture where I'm talking about, of course, like where we think in general that these peoples would have dwelled, for example, the time of the Hunnic domination. And the Heruli do not seem to have been necessarily among the easternmost of these populations. We know the Gepids at some point were... Our problem is, again, we do not have the exact precise location from, especially the years of Attila, during which we do not exactly even know where the major group of the Goths actually were stationed, right? There are some ideas, and we discussed them in other videos, but there were also different groups of Goths, for example. But the Shiri, for example, the sense the Herulis may have been just located in the center in the eye of the storm, because you see that the plain of Vienna is already essentially the Pannonian one, so it would have been very close to the Huns by that point, but slightly on the fringe. And actually this may have they would have had a very important role, especially if the Heruli occupied Vienna, that was not just a small settlement, and other strongholds on the Danube. That would have placed them in an initially important position, for example, towards the Rugians or the Longobards, that are all peoples that do not seem to have gone east of the Elbe in their history. The Heruli, again, we do not clearly understand that, but it's possible that they also had a much more straightforward path towards the south, right? Because many people tend to confuse the war bands with the bulk of the people. And that's a mistake you should never make, right? If I'm not wrong, even the Longobards at some point were indicated on the Tabula Peutingeriana, I think, in the west of Germany. That never happened, all right? But that was probably a mistake on their location. But of course, they were full of, Longobard war bands at some point here and there. But if you look at their migration history, it was the most straightforward ever. They just rose up the Elbe Valley. That's all they did from the Baltics. It's not like they... the Elbe goes on the other side, on the North Sea, but say the Longobards, we talk about their migration had come from likely via Rug and eventually across Pomerania into the essentially the Lüneburg's prairie, the Lüneburg moors. That's also pretty close to the Saxons, at least those would be occupied later by the Saxons. But it's possible, in my opinion, that all these peoples had the most easily straightforward path. It's even possible that the Heruli simply followed, the Oder Valley, which is admittedly a bit more difficult to get to the Danube from. So it's possible that they also descended from the Elbe, rather. Otherwise, you should, if you follow the strange definition of the Eluroi, you should think that they went down the Vistula, then they arrive to the Dnieper River, and then from there they cross all, basically the Carpathians, rose up part of the Danube and settled there. And we do not have any evidence of that. It's true that we don't have it even technically for the Goths that we know at some point made that move. But again, Eluroi, just a term for which the same initial author gives us straightforwardly an Hellenic etymology, not a Germanic one, that in fact wouldn't even make sense, and that is spelled in that way differently from the actual later Heruli, that also seemed to gravitate a bit more around, if not the west, at least being just not particularly in the east, if anything. Really makes me think that there is something a bit more straightforward about this Heruli story. For the rest, everything is possible, but tendentially, again, I tend always to seek sort of the simplest explanation, because, as Occam said, of course, ensia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem, but just, we don't have to exaggerate things in general. We don't have to overly sophisticate things, because people tend to like that. Oh my god, there's the mystery, we don't know. But history is actually much more straightforward than it seems. What you want to appreciate is how apparently cool this people was. Again, not a big one, but still one that left an important mark. We've seen the Rugi recently, and they didn't have much of that military reputation. They had war bands and all, etc., but this Heruli, hell, they seem to have had something. However, they were finally crushed by the Longobards. But this we will see in another video, because today I stop it here, really. Again, we will see the rest of this the story later. If anything, I was glad to start the new year with this content. I'm making, usually this is the time of the year in which I revive the migration era peoples series, and it's one of the most successful ones ever since I started the channel. At some point we will finish the Germanic tribes, which is also what we, generally speaking, began with. If anything, we can count also not just the migration era. I want to make all the ancient tribes as well. But that is sort of, it's nice when you have all these peoples and you can simply check their stories and understanding more or less what happened to them, all in series. I know there is a certain heterogeneity in the way this content is consumed or differently approached, but I see that recently, especially, I've been making really lots of views, which makes me think that this channel is, I think, going finally a bit far by itself. Sometimes you get, again, if you make simpler, I mean, not simpler, but I don't know, what is that I made the other day, by 3 days in a row, the Pannonian Hours, medieval siege, medieval art of siege warfare, and late antiquity historical criticism. 3 videos that get so many views, then you make, and the Go algorithm and whatever, then I make a video that is equally well researched, beautiful pictures, beautiful content on the Italian communal fortified rings. You get none of the views, and that's frustrating, because it's just the same historical quality, equally important topics, but there is a completely different reaction, and that's really a pity, because like the chances that you're going to see more in this way are less, right? It's just like a mathematical thing for the algorithm as well. So you're damaging yourself in watching less and liking less. It doesn't make any sense for the channel, for you for anyone involved. For the rest, again, I was glad to discuss the Heruli. We will finish them on another day. I don't know whether tomorrow or another day. Anyway, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.